Hello, and welcome. I'm so glad you're here tonight. You've pressed play, perhaps as you're settling into bed, maybe with your eyes already heavy, or maybe you're simply curious about a story so old, so deep, that it stretches back beyond human memory, beyond history, beyond even the age of dinosaurs or the rise of mountains as we know them today. It is the story of how life began on Earth, and how, over billions of years, it grew, changed, and shaped everything we see around us. Tonight, we'll drift through that story slowly, gently, in a calm and winding way that may help your mind rest, even as we wander through immense spans of time. So let us begin, not in the present, but far, far back. Imagine the clock of the universe ticking backwards. Not a few hundred years, not a few thousand, not even a few million. Keep going. Wind it back billions of years. The Earth you know, the blue and green planet beneath our feet, did not always look this way. There was a time when Earth was not yet born, when it was only dust floating around a young star. Around 4.6 billion years ago, our Sun came into being from a great swirling cloud of gas and dust in the Milky Way galaxy. It was not the first star, and it will not be the last, but for us, it is the one that matters. Gravity pulled material together, forming a fiery ball at the centre. Around it, a flat disk of leftover dust and rock began to clump together, creating the first seeds of planets. One of those clumps would become our Earth. Now, Earth in its earliest days was not a gentle home. It was hot, violent, and unrecognisable. Imagine a ball of molten rock, glowing with heat, constantly bombarded by other young planetary bodies, some as large as Mars. In fact, one of those collisions is believed to have created our Moon, a smaller body that broke off and settled into orbit tidally linked to us forever after. The sky was filled with glowing debris. The surface churned with volcanoes. Oceans did not yet exist. The air was thick, toxic, and unbreathable. It was a planet, yes, but not yet a place for life. And yet, hidden in these hostile conditions, the seeds of life were slowly being prepared. Water arrived, likely carried by asteroids and comets that rained down in violent bombardments. Imagine for a moment, icy rocks crashing into the molten earth, melting into vapour, and then, over time, cooling into pools. Slowly, the planet that was once only fire and stone gained liquid water, the first oceans. The sound of them would have been strange, boiling, steaming seas, under skies filled with carbon dioxide, methane and nitrogen. No plants swayed in the wind, no animals walked on the shores, for there were no shores, only jagged, lifeless rock. But the water was there, and with water came possibility. Scientists believed that somewhere within these early oceans something remarkable happened. Molecules, which had formed in the chaos of chemistry, began to arrange themselves in more complex patterns. Picture tiny building blocks, carbon and hydrogen, oxygen and nitrogen, swirling together in the soup of the primordial earth. Energy from lightning storms, from volcanic heat, from the sun's ultraviolet rays, all of these forces worked upon the molecules, and eventually, after countless trials and errors, something formed that could copy itself. It was not life as we know it. It had no face, no body, no thought. But it could replicate, and replication is the heart of life. This, many scientists believe, was the very beginning. Somewhere around 3.8 to 4 billion years ago, the first self-replicating molecules came into being. Perhaps they were strands of RNA, simple cousins of the DNA that now guides all living things. They may have been sheltered in little bubbles of fat-like molecules, forming microscopic droplets that protected them from the harsh outside world. In these tiny safe havens, the first protocells were born. Fragile, simple, but persistent. And persistence is what life does best. Imagine the scene, the earth still young, skies tinted orange and red from volcanic gases, oceans dark and steaming, and within those waters, invisible to any eye, the first life stirring. No plants to shade the surface, no animals to stir the seas, only microbes multiplying in silence. The earth itself had no awareness, but if it could feel, perhaps it would have shivered at the quiet birth of something new, something that would eventually change the entire planet. For billions of years, life would remain this way. tiny, microbial, and unseen. And yet, these invisible pioneers began to alter the very atmosphere. Early life likely fed on simple chemicals, perhaps iron and sulfur in the deep oceans. Some of them found a way to harness sunlight, creating energy and releasing oxygen as a byproduct. At first, this oxygen was absorbed by rocks and minerals rusting the planet's surface. But eventually there was more oxygen than the rocks could hold. Slowly, invisibly, the air itself began to change. This was the Great Oxidation Event, a slow but monumental shift. The oxygen that accumulated would someday allow for complex life, for animals that breathe, for us. But for many of the earliest microbes it was poison. Entire worlds of tiny life forms were wiped out by this new element. And yet others adapted. They thrived in the oxygen, and they would give rise to the next chapters of life. As time drifted on, single-celled organisms began to cooperate. Some cells swallowed others, not to consume them, but to live together. One cell might provide energy, while the other provided protection. This cooperation was the birth of eukaryotic cells, cells with nuclei, the kind that make up plants, animals, fungi, and us. It was a quiet revolution, happening invisibly in the waters of ancient Earth, but it was the foundation for everything to come. The story of life is patient. Billions of years pass with only tiny changes, and yet those tiny changes accumulate into wonders. From the first molecules that copied themselves to cells that learned to work together, to the first multicellular organisms that clung to the ocean floor, life continued to experiment, to branch, to explore every possibility. And all of this, all of these unimaginable ages of time, came before even the hint of animals. Before the first fins, before the first wings, before the first steps on land, there were billions of years of nothing but microbial worlds. Oceans filled with mats of bacteria spreading and growing, exhaling oxygen, shaping the chemistry of the planet. If we could walk along those ancient shores, we might think the world was empty. But beneath the waves, life was at work, slowly, invisibly, rewriting the future. So tonight, as you rest, think of that long patience. The way life began, not with noise and drama, but with the quiet persistence of molecules in water. Our story is vast, stretching back over 4 billion years, and we are only at the beginning. The first sparks have appeared. The first cells have formed. The Earth, once a lifeless rock, now carries within it something alive, something that will never end. And as we continue, we'll follow life's journey, from microbes to more complex forms, through oceans that teemed with creatures strange and wonderful, into the rise of plants, animals, and eventually humans. But for now, let's stay here a little longer, in those early oceans with the tiny cells that began it all, and remember that every living thing, every tree, every bird, every person, carries within it the echo of those first beginnings. For billions of years, the Earth was quiet in a way that is difficult to imagine. The continents had not yet taken their final shapes. The skies were different. The oceans, so vast and deep, hid the most important drama on the planet, though it was invisible to any eye. For nearly 3 billion years, life consisted of nothing more than microbes. These tiny beings multiplied and adapted, building invisible empires in the oceans. Some formed mats along the seafloor, structures known today as stromatolites, layered colonies of bacteria that grew slowly upward toward the light. They were simple, yet they were also engineers. They helped fill the air with oxygen, reshaping the chemistry of Earth, preparing it for something greater to come. But the leap from single cells to something more complex was not simple. It was one of the greatest transitions in the history of life. Somewhere, perhaps around 2 billion years ago, some cells began to work together in a new way. They were no longer just colonies of separate individuals. They began to merge into unified beings. Cells specialized, one handling energy, another handling structure, another protecting. It was cooperation at the tiniest level, but it laid the foundation for multicellular life. For a very long time, multicellular organisms remained tiny and soft, too delicate to leave behind fossils that would survive to our time, yet they existed. Thin filaments, microscopic clusters, faint beginnings. They grew in shadows, unnoticed, for hundreds of millions of years. Life was patient. It always is. Then, about 600 million years ago, something shifted. The oceans began to stir with new forms. Strange, soft-bodied creatures appeared unlike anything we know today. These were the beings of the Ediacaran period, some of the first visible multicellular organisms. Imagine flat, frond-like shapes lying upon the seafloor, shaped like leaves, or discs pressed into the sand. Some looked like quilted cushions, others like feathery fans. They had no eyes, no bones, no mouths as we would recognize them. Their lives were gentle and alien, drifting and absorbing nutrients directly from the water. These creatures spread across the shallow seas of Earth, leaving impressions of their forms behind in the sand. To us they appear ghost-like, delicate imprints from a world where animals were just beginning to experiment with shape. This was not yet the world of predators and prey. It was still a quiet world, one of stillness and slow movement. But beneath that calm surface, evolution was preparing something extraordinary. And then, around 541 million years ago, the quiet broke. Something happened that scientists call the Cambrian explosion. Within a geologically short span of time, perhaps only 20 or 30 million years, life leapt forward in a burst of diversity. Creatures with hard shells, with limbs, with eyes, and with teeth appeared. Oceans that had once been filled with simple, soft-bodied beings suddenly swarmed with creatures of every shape and size. No one knows exactly why this explosion of life happened when it did. Perhaps oxygen levels had finally risen enough to support complex bodies. Perhaps genetic innovations, like the development of new ways to build body plans, unlocked endless possibilities. Or perhaps the arms race between predator and prey had begun, driving rapid change. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The world was transformed. Imagine looking into the Cambrian seas, where once there had been little more than microbial mats and drifting fronds. Now there were trilobites crawling across the seafloor, their bodies armoured in segmented shells. There were strange creatures like Anomalocaris, with grasping limbs and a circular mouth lined with teeth, gliding like a predator through the water. There were spiny worms, sponges, and the first animals with eyes that could truly see. The seas glittered with colour and movement, a sudden bloom of forms never seen before. It was here that the basic body plans of nearly all modern animals were first established. Creatures with backbones, with shells, with legs. The blueprints were drawn in the Cambrian, and they remain with us even now. Every fish, every insect, every mammal, even us, traces its deep ancestry to the great experimentation of these oceans. And yet, as dazzling as the Cambrian explosion was, life still remained in the water. Land was barren, silent, a rocky landscape with no plants to soften it, no animals to cross it. The drama of life was still confined to the sea. Coral-like reefs began to form, trilobites scuttled in the sand, and predators darted among them. A new dynamic filled the earth. Predator and prey, hunter and hunted. The dance of survival that would drive evolution forward for the rest of time. If you close your eyes, you might imagine the sounds of those ancient seas. Not the calls of whales, not the songs of dolphins, for those would come far, far later. Instead, the Cambrian oceans were filled with the silent rush of water, the scrape of shells against sand, the flick of soft limbs propelling creatures through the depths. It was a strange and alien world, and yet it is our world too, for within it lie the roots of everything we are. As time passed, new creatures arose. Some grew larger, others grew more complex. The seas became ecosystems filled with layers of life, from the smallest plankton to the fiercest predators. Life had found momentum. It would never return to the quiet simplicity of before. The blueprint of survival was set in motion. And still, for hundreds of millions of years, all of this remained hidden beneath the surface of the ocean. The land remained empty. Winds blew across barren rock. Rains fell on soil that had not yet known the touch of roots. The continents shifted slowly, grinding against one another, breaking apart, colliding again. Volcanoes rose, seas receded, glaciers came and went. The earth was restless, always reshaping itself. And through it all, life endured in the oceans, adapting to every change, preparing unknowingly for its greatest leap yet, the conquest of the land. But for now, in this part of the story, let us stay in the oceans of the Cambrian, where life is still new and exuberant, bursting with strange beauty. For it was here that the earth truly became alive with movement, with sensation, with the complexity that would define all of its future. Life had taken root, and it would never let go. For so long, the land had remained empty. Imagine it. The continents bare and rocky, shaped by wind and rain, but silent, without a single blade of grass, without a tree to sway in the air, without an insect to crawl upon the stones. The oceans roared with new life after the Cambrian explosion, yet when the waves broke against the shores, they met only lifeless sand and stone. It is strange to think of our planet this way, for we are so accustomed to seeing land as vibrant and green, filled with forests, fields, and animals. But for much of Earth's history, land was silent, untouched by life. Still, even then, in the shallow waters near the shore, hints of change were stirring. Plants had not yet arisen, but tiny forms of algae clung to wet surfaces, and colonies of microbes formed dark mats across tidal flats. Life was testing the edges, reaching outward from the sea but not yet ready to step fully onto dry ground. For hundreds of millions of years, this slow experimentation continued, until at last, about 470 million years ago, the first true plants appeared. They were not tall trees or flowering plants as we know them today. They were small, moss-like pioneers, creeping low along the ground, hugging the damp soil near water's edge. They had no roots, no wood, no flowers, but they could survive outside of the sea, drawing water directly from the dampness of the earth and the mist of rain. These first plants began to spread, greening the shorelines, turning what had been bare rock into something softer, something alive. With them came another kind of pioneer, fungi. Fungi had existed in the oceans for ages, but on land they found a new opportunity. They formed partnerships with the early plants, wrapping around their roots, helping them to absorb nutrients from the soil in exchange for sugars. It was a relationship that endures even now, in nearly every forest and field on Earth. Plants and fungi together transformed the land. The once barren continents slowly became covered with mats of greenery, fragile but persistent. As plants spread, they changed everything. They captured sunlight and breathed oxygen into the air. They stabilized the soil, slowed erosion, and created tiny habitats where other life might follow. Slowly, the atmosphere grew richer in oxygen, and the land itself became more welcoming. The door was opening for animals. The first animals to test this new frontier were not large or dramatic. Around 450 million years ago, tiny invertebrates, relatives of modern-day insects, spiders, and centipedes, began to creep out of the sea. They likely followed the plants, feeding on their tissues or on the decaying organic matter they left behind. Imagine small, many-legged creatures scuttling among mats of moss, leaving the first tracks ever pressed into dry soil. These humble pioneers were the beginning of a great invasion. Still, life on land was not easy. The air was dry, the sun harsh, and without the buoyant support of water, bodies struggled under their own weight. Yet, step by step, life adapted. Plants grew taller, developing vascular tissues that allowed them to carry water upward. With this innovation, they could grow above the ground in stalks and stems. Soon, ancient ferns and towering spore-bearing plants covered the land. By 400 million years ago, great swampy forests stretched across continents, their canopies reaching high into the air. The earth was greening in a way it never had before, and with these forests came new opportunities. Insects diversified, some developing wings to glide above the plants. Millipedes, scorpions, and early spiders prowled the undergrowth. The land was no longer empty. It was alive with the quiet movements of countless small creatures. But the greatest leap was yet to come. In the oceans, fish had grown strong and varied. Some developed sturdy fins, able to push themselves along the seafloor. In shallow waters, where tides shifted and pools dried, some fish began to gulp air with primitive lungs. These were the ancestors of the first vertebrates to walk on land. Slowly, over millions of years, fins grew into limbs and fish became amphibians. Around 375 million years ago, one of these transitional creatures, known to us through fossils like Tiktaalik, pulled itself out of the water and onto the shore. It was not graceful. Its body was still fish-like, but its fins had jointed bones strong enough to support it in the shallows. With this step, small though it may have seemed, the conquest of land by vertebrates began. Amphibians multiplied, living partly in water and partly on land, laying their eggs in pools but hunting along the edges of the shore. The world was transformed again. Where once only moss and algae clung to wet stone, now forests grew tall and green, insects buzzed through the air and amphibians prowled in the shadows. The silence of the land had ended. For the first time in Earth's history, the continents themselves were alive with sound and movement. The forests of this time were unlike those we know today. Towering trees called lycophytes and giant horsetails rose into the air, some more than 30 meters tall. Their trunks were hollow, their leaves spiny, their reproduction carried out with spores instead of seeds. The ground beneath them was damp and crowded with ferns, and through it all, the slow rhythm of evolution continued. Amphibians gave rise to reptiles, creatures better suited to dry land. Unlike amphibians, reptiles laid eggs with protective shells, allowing them to reproduce away from water. This simple change freed them to roam deeper into the continents, to spread across environments that amphibians could not survive in. It was another quiet revolution, opening the way for life to spread into deserts, plains, and forests alike. So the earth, once silent stone, had become a living world. Plants softened the ground and reached upward toward the sun. Fungi wove hidden networks beneath the soil. Insects crawled, scuttled, and flew. Amphibians and reptiles prowled the swamps. The continents that had once been lifeless had become vibrant, humming landscapes filled with green and movement. When you picture it, try to imagine not just the great trees and giant insects, but the atmosphere itself. The air thick with oxygen, the ground damp with moss and fern, the shadows shifting as strange creatures moved slowly between the trunks. The earth had entered a new chapter. Life had left the oceans and claimed the land, and from this point forward, there would be no turning back. As the forests thickened and the air grew heavy with oxygen, the small reptiles that had first crept onto land began to spread. They were not large at first, nor remarkable in appearance, but they carried with them a crucial advantage. Their eggs, protected by leathery or hardened shells, could survive away from water. Unlike amphibians, who needed ponds and swamps to lay their eggs, reptiles could wander into drier places, onto rocky highlands or into arid plains, and still raise their young. This simple adaptation quietly changed the balance of life on land. Over millions of years, reptiles began to diversify. Some remained small, darting among the ferns and moss, while others grew larger, filling niches that no creature had occupied before. They were shaped by the slow shifting of continents, by climates that swung from humid heat to dry desolation, and by the relentless test of survival. Their scales protected them from drying out, their limbs grew stronger for walking across land, and their lungs became more efficient at drawing oxygen from the air. They were becoming masters of the continents. The forests they roamed were vast and swampy, filled with towering trees that would, over ages, give rise to the coal deposits we know today. Insects hummed through the air, some enormous in size, gliding and buzzing in the heavy atmosphere. Amphibians still lurked in the marshes, but reptiles were pushing farther and farther afield, spreading across the land in ways no creature had done before. And then, in time, the Earth shifted again. Around 252 million years ago, a catastrophe unfolded. The Great Dying, the largest mass extinction in Earth's history. Vast volcanic eruptions poured gases into the air, warming the climate, acidifying the oceans and choking life across the globe. Nearly 90% of marine species disappeared, along with 70% of land species. Forests fell silent, oceans emptied. It was a time of devastation, when the future of life itself seemed uncertain. But life endures. From the shadows of this great extinction, new forms arose. Among the survivors were reptiles, some of which would give rise to the most famous creatures ever to walk the earth, the dinosaurs. The earliest dinosaurs were not the giants we picture today. They were small, two-legged creatures, swift and light, running on strong hind limbs with long tails to balance them. They were hunters and scavengers, competing with other reptiles in the recovering ecosystems. Slowly, through countless generations, they spread and diversified. Some grew larger, their bodies lengthening, their necks stretching high. Others became armoured, their backs lined with plates and spikes. Still others developed sharp teeth and claws, rising as predators to dominate the food chains. The Triassic period gave way to the Jurassic, and the world was transformed once more. The supercontinent Pangaea began to break apart, creating new coastlines, new climates, and new opportunities. Dinosaurs thrived in these shifting landscapes. In the warm, humid air, forests of conifers, cycads, and ferns spread across the continents, and within them, dinosaurs grew to enormous sizes. Imagine the Jurassic world, towering sauropods, their necks reaching high into the trees, plucking leaves from the canopy. Herds of them moving slowly across plains, their footsteps shaking the ground. Predators like Allosaurus stalking among them, swift and deadly, their teeth sharp and glistening. Smaller dinosaurs darting between the shadows, feeding on insects or scurrying after plants. The land that had once been silent stone was now filled with thunderous movement, with the cries of reptiles that ruled every corner of the earth. The oceans, too, were alive with reptiles. Ichthyosaurs shaped like dolphins, speeding through the waters, plesiosaurs with long necks gliding gracefully under the waves, and great marine crocodiles lurking in the shallows. Life had rebounded from the Great Dying with astonishing vigour, filling every niche with new forms. For millions upon millions of years, dinosaurs flourished. They adapted to every environment, from lush forests to dry deserts, from swamps to high plains. Some became armoured with horns and shields like Triceratops. Others grew to colossal size like Brachiosaurus, towering above the trees. Predators grew more specialised, some fast and slender, others massive and powerful. The world belonged to them, and they shaped its ecosystems for over 160 million years. During this time, another lineage was quietly taking shape. Small feathered dinosaurs began to experiment with flight. Their feathers may have first served as insulation or display, but in time they allowed for gliding and eventually powered flight. From these humble beginnings, birds were born. To this day, every sparrow and eagle carries within it the legacy of dinosaurs that took to the skies. But while dinosaurs dominated the land and the skies, another group of creatures lived in their shadow, small furry mammals. They were tiny compared to the giants around them, scurrying at night, feeding on insects and seeds, hiding in burrows and trees. For millions of years, mammals remained small and obscure, overshadowed by the reptiles that towered above them. Yet, they endured, waiting quietly for their chance. The age of dinosaurs was long and steady, marked by both majesty and stability. Forests stretched across the continents, filled with ferns, cycads, and conifers. Rivers wound through valleys, their banks lined with strange plants, unlike the flowers we know today. For flowering plants had not yet appeared. Volcanoes rumbled, continents drifted, but life continued, resilient and flourishing. And then, as it always does, change came again. Around 145 million years ago, flowering plants began to emerge. They were small at first, delicate and modest compared to the towering conifers. But they carried an innovation, seeds protected within fruits and flowers that attracted pollinators. Insects, already buzzing and crawling across the land, found new partnerships with these plants. Bees, butterflies and beetles spread pollen from flower to flower, helping the plants reproduce more efficiently. Slowly the landscape changed, filling with colour and fragrance, softening the ancient forests with blossoms. Dinosaurs adapted to this new world as well. Some grazed on flowering plants, others hunted among the fields they created. The ecosystems grew richer, more varied, filled with interactions between plants, insects, and animals. Life was weaving itself into an ever more intricate tapestry, one thread at a time. Through all of this, the dinosaurs remained supreme. For over 100 million years, they strode across the earth, their herds and predators shaping the land, their calls echoing through forests and plains. It was an age of grandeur, a time when reptiles ruled without challenge, and the earth itself seemed to belong to them alone. Yet no reign lasts forever. Even the mightiest fall. But that part of the story, the end of the dinosaurs and the rise of mammals, would come later. For now, as we linger in this part of Earth's history, let us stay in the warmth of the Mesozoic world, a planet lush and green, filled with giants that grazed beneath the trees and predators that hunted in the shadows. It was a world unlike any that has come before or since, and its memory still stirs within the stones of the earth, written in fossils that whisper of an age long past. For over 160 million years, dinosaurs had walked the earth. They had survived changing climates, shifting continents, rising seas and falling forests. They had spread into every niche, filling the land, the skies, and even returning to the oceans in reptilian forms that swam like fish. It must have seemed, if the earth could feel, that they would last forever. But permanence is an illusion. Even the longest reigns end, and for the dinosaurs their end came suddenly in fire and shadow. Around 66 million years ago, the earth was struck by a visitor from space. A vast asteroid, several kilometres wide, hurtled toward the planet, its speed unimaginable, its power devastating. It struck near the coast of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, carving out the Chicxulub crater, more than 150 kilometres wide. In an instant, forests were flattened, seas were pushed into towering waves, and the sky itself filled with fire. The force was greater than billions of atomic bombs, a moment of destruction on a scale beyond comprehension. The impact unleashed a chain of catastrophes. Dust and vapour filled the air, blocking sunlight for months, perhaps years. Plants withered in the darkness, temperatures plummeted, the food chains that had sustained dinosaurs and countless other creatures collapsed. Some dinosaurs may have survived the first shock, hiding in forests or swamps. But as the months passed, hunger and cold claimed them. One by one, species vanished. The great sauropods, the armoured stegosaurs, the swift raptors, even the mighty Tyrannosaurus rex, all disappeared. But not everything was lost. Some small creatures endured. Birds, descendants of feathered dinosaurs, survived in scattered populations, taking to the skies that had darkened above their fallen kin. Crocodiles, lurking in rivers and swamps, endured as they had for millions of years. And mammals, those small, often nocturnal creatures that had lived quietly in the shadows of the dinosaurs, found themselves stepping into a world suddenly empty of giants. For mammals, this was a turning point. For more than 100 million years they had remained small, some no larger than mice, others the size of raccoons. They lived at night, hiding in burrows, feeding on insects, seeds and fruit. They had never been able to compete with the enormous reptiles that dominated the Earth. But when the asteroid struck, the balance shifted. The world that had once belonged to the dinosaurs was now open, waiting for new rulers. The early mammals were varied in form. Some were insect eaters, with sharp teeth for crunching beetles and worms. Others nibbled on plants or hunted smaller animals. With the fall of the dinosaurs, these mammals began to spread, exploring new environments, adapting quickly to the changed world. Their bodies grew larger, their behaviours more complex. Evolution had given them tools that would prove invaluable. Warm-blooded bodies that allowed them to stay active in cold or heat. Fur that protected them from the elements. And most importantly, a new way of caring for their young. Unlike reptiles, which often laid eggs and left their offspring to fend for themselves, mammals carried their young within their bodies, nourishing them before birth. Afterward, they fed their young with milk, ensuring that even fragile newborns could survive in harsh conditions. This deep care gave mammals an advantage. Their young were more likely to survive, to grow, to learn. In the chaos after the asteroid, when food was scarce and climates uncertain, this advantage helped them endure where others might fail. The forests, once filled with dinosaurs, slowly changed. Flowering plants spread further, filling the landscapes with blossoms and fruits. Insects multiplied, pollinating the new growth, while mammals began to take on new forms to feed on the abundance. Some remained small, darting among the leaves. Others grew larger, exploring the ground, becoming grazers and hunters. Each generation adapted, each change opening new possibilities. Over millions of years, the variety of mammals increased. Some took to the trees, their hands and feet becoming nimble for climbing. Others returned to the water, evolving into sleek swimmers like whales and dolphins. Some grew hooves, running swiftly across open plains. Others became predators, their teeth and claws sharpened for the chase. In the absence of dinosaurs, mammals had room to experiment, to diversify, to fill the roles that had once belonged to reptiles, and as they spread, they shaped the world around them. Herds of plant-eating mammals grazed across fields, keeping forests in check and opening spaces for grasslands. Predators followed them, balancing the herds and driving evolution forward. The earth once again became alive with new sounds: the footsteps of hooves, the calls of mammals across valleys, the rustle of leaves as creatures climbed through trees. Among these mammals was a lineage of particular interest to us: the primates. Small at first, with grasping hands and keen eyes, they lived in forests, feeding on fruit, insects, and leaves. They were not yet human, not even close, but within them were the beginnings of what we would one day become. Their hands allowed them to climb, to grasp, to explore. Their eyes faced forward, giving them depth perception for leaping through branches. Their social lives grew more complex as they lived in groups, grooming and protecting one another. The world after the dinosaurs was not empty, not silent. It was a world of recovery, of slow regrowth, of new possibilities. Mammals thrived where once they had hidden, and from them would rise elephants, lions, deer, whales, monkeys, and eventually us. The fall of the dinosaurs had cleared the stage, and in the stillness that followed, a new drama began. It is worth pausing here to reflect on the rhythm of it all. The Earth, across billions of years, endures cycles of destruction and renewal. Life rises, flourishes, and sometimes falls, yet always something survives, always something endures to carry the story forward. The asteroid that ended the dinosaurs was not the end of life, but the beginning of a new chapter. And in that chapter, mammals, once small and overlooked, began their long ascent. In the long quiet after the fall of the dinosaurs, forests spread across much of the Earth. The air grew warm again, the skies brightened, and the lands, once covered in ash and silence, filled with green leaves and birdsong. This was a world of trees, flowers, and fruit, and among these branches new creatures were stirring. They were small mammals at first, with soft fur and delicate hands, and they would become the ancestors of a family that would one day include us. These were the early primates. They were not large or imposing. They were not the giants of their world, nor were they the fastest runners or fiercest hunters. Instead, their advantage lay in their hands and eyes. Their fingers could curl around branches, grasping and holding with precision. Their eyes, facing forward, overlapped in vision, allowing them to judge distances as they leapt from branch to branch. Their world was three-dimensional, filled with trunks, leaves, and swinging vines, and their bodies adapted perfectly to it. The forests were alive with fruit, flowers, and insects, and primates learned to feed on all of them. They became flexible in diet, able to survive on whatever the season provided. Some gnawed on seeds and nuts, cracking them with small but sharp teeth. Others plucked insects from leaves or sipped nectar from flowers. Over time, their brains grew larger, for life in the forest canopy demanded more than instinct. To leap from one tree to another required memory, calculation, and awareness. To live in groups required cooperation and subtle forms of communication. Slowly, thought deepened. As the millions of years passed, the forests themselves changed. Great stretches of land rose and fell, climates shifted, and the earth went through cycles of warming and cooling. Primates adapted in many directions. Some grew small and nimble, darting through branches like tiny squirrels. Others became larger, their hands strong enough to grip tree trunks. The lemurs of Madagascar, the tarsiers of Asia, the monkeys of Africa and the Americas, all came from these ancient beginnings, branching off into their own forms and lives. Among them, a particular branch emerged that would one day matter greatly to our story: the apes. They were larger than most monkeys, their arms long and strong for swinging through trees. They did not rely on tails for balance, as monkeys often did, but instead used their bodies and hands with remarkable skill. They were curious, social, and intelligent, their minds growing sharper as their groups became more complex. Apes spread through Africa and Asia, and in their variety they explored many ways of living. Some stayed in the forests, eating fruits and leaves. Others ventured into more open lands, learning to climb down from the trees and forage on the ground. Slowly their behaviours grew more flexible. They could remember where food was, recognise each other's calls, and even use simple tools like branches to reach insects or stones to crack nuts. It is easy, from the vantage point of today, to imagine a straight line from these early apes to us, but the truth is gentler, more meandering. Evolution does not draw straight paths. It branches like a river delta, sending streams in many directions. Many of these streams would end, while others would flow forward. The gibbons, the orangutans, the gorillas, and the chimpanzees, all are part of this great branching story, each as ancient in lineage as we are. Somewhere between 7 and 6 million years ago, in the forests and grasslands of Africa, one branch began to diverge from the others. This was the beginning of the human lineage. It was not sudden, nor was it dramatic. There was no single creature that could be called the first human. Instead, there were populations, slowly changing across generations. Some of these early beings still climbed trees, their arms strong for pulling themselves upward, yet they also began to walk upright more often, their feet adjusting for life on the ground. The reasons for this change are lost to time, but the earth itself offers clues. Africa was changing. Forests were shrinking in some regions, replaced by open savannas and grasslands. To survive here meant travelling longer distances between trees, standing taller to see across the grasses, freeing the hands to carry food or young. The first steps upright may have been uncertain, but with each generation they grew more natural. Standing tall offered advantages, and slowly over countless years it became the norm. These early ancestors, known to science through fragments of bone and tooth, were not yet human. They were beings like Ardipithecus and later Australopithecus, who lived between 4 and 2 million years ago. They were small, perhaps no taller than a modern child, with long arms and curved fingers for climbing. Yet their pelvis and legs showed that they could walk upright. They lived between two worlds, the world of the trees and the world of the ground. On the ground, they gathered fruits, nuts, roots, and small animals. They may have used simple tools, though nothing like what would come later. They lived in groups, perhaps for protection against predators, for the savannas were home to lions, leopards, and hyenas even then. Their lives were not easy, but they endured, passing their traits to the generations that followed. It is soothing to think of them as distant relatives, living their quiet lives so long ago. They did not know what they would one day become, nor could they imagine us sitting here and remembering them. They were simply alive, eating, sleeping, raising young, and moving through the landscapes of Africa. Yet within them were the seeds of something extraordinary, the ability to stand, to carry, to use their hands in ways no creature had done before. From these beginnings our lineage would continue, one step at a time. It would not be a sudden leap into humanity, but a slow unfolding, shaped by climate, by need, and by chance. The forests, the rivers, the shifting lands of Africa would nurture these ancestors, giving them challenges to meet and spaces to grow. And little by little, the story of humanity would take shape, though for now it remained only a whisper in the long song of life. The ancestors who walked upright in the African savannas lived their days without knowledge of the vast story they were a part of. They were simply surviving, as every creature does, searching for food, protecting their young, and moving through the shifting landscapes. Their bones, left behind and buried beneath soil and stone, would one day tell us their names: Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus africanus, and others like them. These beings lived between 4 and 2 million years ago, standing only about a metre tall, with long arms for climbing, and teeth adapted to chew both plants and tougher foods. Among the most famous of them was one individual, discovered in the Ethiopian highlands, whose fossil remains came to be called Lucy. She was small, light-boned, and walked upright, though still at home in the trees. Lucy herself is long gone, but her bones remind us that our own story runs deep into the past. For hundreds of thousands of years, beings like Lucy lived in Africa. They were not alone. Many different species of the early hominins shared the continent at the same time, each adapting in its own way. Some may have favoured the forests, others the open plains. Some relied on nuts and fruits, while others experimented with harder foods. But from this diversity, one branch began to shift in a new direction. Around 2.5 million years ago, something changed. The earth was cooling and the climate grew less stable. Forests thinned and grasslands spread. To survive, creatures needed to be clever, adaptable, and resourceful. It was in this moment that the first members of our genus, Homo, appeared. Their brains were larger than those of Australopithecus. Their faces were flatter, their teeth smaller, and their hands more capable of precision. These were small differences at first, barely noticeable over generations, but they marked the beginning of something new. With these changes came the ability to do something extraordinary, to make tools deliberately. Stones, once just part of the landscape, became instruments in their hands. By striking one rock against another, they learned to create sharp edges. These edges could cut meat, scrape hides, or break open bones to reach the rich marrow inside. This was the Oldowan tradition, named after the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where some of the first examples were found. The tools were simple by our standards: sharp flakes, heavy cores, pounding stones, but they opened new possibilities. Meat, which had once been difficult to access, now became a valuable part of the diet. The marrow inside bones offered dense energy, essential for fueling the larger brains that were slowly evolving. Scavenging carcasses left by lions or hyenas, early humans could crack bones open and reach what other animals left behind. Little by little, their diet grew richer, their strength greater, and their lives more flexible. The ability to shape stone was more than just a survival trick. It was a doorway to culture. To create a tool required thought, planning, and memory. A sharp edge could be carried, used later, or even passed from hand to hand. In this way, knowledge began to travel across generations. What one individual learned could be shared, and in time, communities grew around these shared skills. The early members of Homo were still small, perhaps a little over a metre tall, with long arms and short legs compared to us. They lived in groups, moving together in search of food and water. The African landscape was not easy. Predators still roamed, and the seasons could be harsh, but they endured. Some species, like Homo habilis, are thought to be among the first true toolmakers. Their name means handy man, for it was their skill with stone that first marked them out. Over time, some populations gave rise to even larger, more robust forms. Around 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus appeared. They were taller than their ancestors, with longer legs built for walking. Unlike earlier hominins, Homo erectus could travel far across the land. Their bodies were adapted to endurance, to covering long distances in open terrain, and travel they did. From Africa, they spread into Asia and Europe, carrying their tools and their ways of life with them. With Homo erectus came a refinement of stone tools. The Apulian tradition emerged, carefully shaped hand axes, symmetrical and sharp, crafted with purpose. These tools were more than just flakes of stone. They were designs, repeated across time and place, suggesting that ideas were being shared, remembered, and passed on. The control of fire may also have begun with Homo erectus. Though the evidence is debated, traces of ancient hearths suggest that at least some groups learned to tend flames, to cook food, to stay warm in cold nights, and to keep predators away. Fire brought light to the darkness and warmth to the chill. It softened roots and meat, making them easier to eat, and may have freed energy for brains to grow even larger. Life was still difficult, of course. These early humans faced droughts, predators, disease, and the ever-changing climates of the Ice Age world. Yet they adapted, always finding new ways to endure. Their footprints, left in volcanic ash, show small groups walking together, young and old, side by side. Their tools, scattered in ancient riverbeds, reveal persistence and patience. From them, many other lineages would arise. Some would vanish, their bones left behind as silent witnesses. Others would carry forward the thread that would eventually lead to us. The world of 2 million years ago was not empty but crowded with cousins. Multiple kinds of humans sharing the earth, each exploring its own path. When we look back, it is tempting to see only ourselves, to imagine that everything was leading to modern humanity. But the truth is softer. We are just one branch of a tree that once spread wide across the continents. The others mattered too, living full lives in their own times, each a part of the story of life. And so, from the quiet steps of Australopithecus to the tool-making hands of Homo habilis, and the long journeys of Homo erectus, the story of humanity deepened. It was a story written not in words but in stones, bones, and firelight. A story whispered across millions of years, carrying us ever closer to who we are today. When Homo erectus first stepped beyond Africa nearly 2 million years ago, the world was vast and wild. Forests stretched across Asia, deserts shimmered in the Middle East, and Europe was a land of shifting ice and grasslands. These early travellers carried only stone tools, fire when they could keep it, and their own endurance, yet they spread far, leaving traces in lands thousands of kilometres from their origin. In Asia, they left fossils in places as distant as Java and China. In Indonesia, remains discovered in the early 20th century came to be known as Java Man, among the first hints that humans had such ancient, far-flung ancestors. In northern China, a Zhoukoudian, Peking man lived in caves nearly 700,000 years ago. The bones and tools found there suggest lives much like those in Africa, hunting, scavenging, shaping stone, and tending fire when possible. These journeys were not sudden migrations but slow drifts, generation after generation following rivers, coasts, and herds. For hundreds of thousands of years, groups settled and adapted. Some survived, others faded away. The Earth itself was restless, its climate shifting with the great pulse of the ice ages. Glaciers advanced and retreated, changing the face of the continents. Grasslands gave way to forests, then back again. Each change forced adaptation, and only the most resilient endured. From Homo erectus, other forms began to branch off. Around 700,000 years ago in Africa, a new lineage emerged, Homo heidelbergensis. Their fossils were first discovered in Germany, near the town of Heidelberg, where a strong jawbone was unearthed in 1907. This species was larger and more robust than their ancestors, with brains approaching the size of our own. They were skilled hunters, capable of bringing down large animals with wooden spears sharpened to deadly points. Homo heidelbergensis is thought to be the common ancestor of both the Neanderthals in Europe and modern humans in Africa. They spread widely, living in Europe, Asia, and Africa, adapting to many environments. In Europe, as the ice ages deepened, some populations of heidelbergensis slowly evolved into Neanderthals. In Africa, others gave rise to Homo sapiens, our own species. The Neanderthals, or Homo neanderthalensis, became masters of the cold northern lands. Stocky, with broad noses and powerful builds, they were perfectly adapted for life in the harsh climates of Ice Age Europe. Their tools grew more sophisticated, their culture richer. They buried their dead, cared for their injured, and may even have painted on cave walls. For more than 300,000 years they thrived, long before we ever set foot in Europe. Yet they were not the only ones. In distant islands, other remarkable humans appeared. On the island of Flores in Indonesia, tiny people no taller than a child lived until just 50,000 years ago. Known as Homo floresiensis, or the hobbits, they crafted stone tools and hunted small elephants and giant rats. Their small size was not a sign of weakness, but of adaptation. On islands, resources are limited, and over generations, species often shrink. Elsewhere, in the caves of South Africa, fossils revealed another surprising branch, Homo naledi. Discovered only recently, these beings had small brains, but bodies capable of climbing and walking upright. What startled scientists most was evidence that they may have deliberately placed their dead in deep caves, suggesting ritual behaviour in a species with a brain much smaller than ours. The family tree of humanity was not a straight line, but a tangled forest. At least a dozen kinds of humans lived at different times, overlapping, interacting, and perhaps even sharing knowledge. Some were tall and strong, others small and light. Some thrived in icy tundra, others in tropical forests. For millions of years, the world was never inhabited by just one kind of human. All the while, Homo sapiens was slowly taking shape in Africa. About 300,000 years ago, the first early members of our species appeared. Their skulls show a mix of old and new traits, but their brains were fully modern. They looked much like us, though their lives were still bound to stone, fire, and hunting. For tens of thousands of years they remained in Africa, sharing the continent with other humans like Homo heidelbergensis, and perhaps even late surviving Homo erectus. The stage was now set for a new chapter in the long story. Soon Homo sapiens would spread out of Africa, just as Homo erectus had done long before. But this time, something would be different. They carried not only tools and fire, but also art, language, and imagination. As the Ice Age tightened its grip, the world was crowded with humans of many kinds. Neanderthals roamed Europe, Denisovans lived in Asia, hobbits thrived on islands, and early sapiens hunted in Africa. For a moment in deep time, the Earth was shared by a family of cousins, each shaping the land in its own way. The story was no longer just about survival, but about culture, creativity, and connection. The long flow of evolution had carried life from the first spark in the ancient seas to this astonishing moment. A planet alive with many different kinds of humans, each telling their story in tools, bones, and quiet footprints on the Earth. The world, by 200,000 to 100,000 years ago, was a patchwork of many human kinds. Neanderthals roamed across Europe and Western Asia, sturdy and clever in the cold. Denisovans lived somewhere in the vast forests and mountains of Asia, known today mostly through fragments of bone and teeth. On islands in Indonesia, the hobbits still thrived, small and resourceful. In Africa, our own ancestors, Homo sapiens, were learning the rhythms of the land, carrying with them tools, fire, and something else entirely: imagination. Africa was the cradle where sapiens had taken shape. The land offered forests and grasslands, coasts and rivers. Here they hunted gazelles, fished in streams, and gathered roots, berries, and seeds. Slowly they began to decorate shells, carve shapes from bone, and create pigments from minerals. These were not just tools for survival, but symbols, signs that minds were reaching for meaning. Then, around 70,000 years ago, small groups began to leave Africa. It was not one great exodus, but a trickle that became a flow. Families followed coasts, moved along rivers, and crossed narrow seas. The Red Sea and the Sinai Peninsula became pathways into Arabia. From there they drifted east into Asia, south into India, and eventually much farther still. Everywhere they went, they met new lands and sometimes new humans. In the Levant, sapiens came face to face with Neanderthals. At first, they may have competed for the same caves, the same animals, but their encounters were not only of conflict. DNA today tells us that they interbred. The traces of Neanderthal lives remain within us, woven into our very genes. In Asia, encounters with Denisovans also left their mark. High in the Tibetan plateau, a piece of jawbone preserved in a cave revealed a Denisovan presence. Modern people in that region still carry genes from Denisovans that help them breathe more easily at high altitudes. Far away, in places like Papua New Guinea and Australia, descendants of those ancient meetings still carry Denisovan DNA. As sapiens spread, their culture deepened. By 50,000 years ago, art began to bloom. In caves, ochre-red handprints appeared, human presence made eternal on stone walls. Carvings of animals showed not only observation, but imagination. Tiny figurines, perhaps of fertility or spirit, hinted at beliefs beyond survival. Language, though invisible in the record, must have flourished. The ability to tell stories, share instructions, and dream aloud together gave sapiens an unmatched advantage. While Neanderthals were skilled and intelligent, their numbers were few and their communities small. Sapiens, by contrast, seemed able to weave larger networks, binding groups across distance through symbols, trade, and shared myths. A piece of obsidian from far away could be carried and exchanged, a sign of connection beyond a single valley. By 40,000 years ago, humans had reached Australia, crossing seas with rafts or boats. They carried with them fire, stone, and art. Rock shelters in Arnhem Land preserve paintings tens of thousands of years old, showing that culture had blossomed in every corner they reached. In Europe they spread into lands long home to Neanderthals. For thousands of years the two species lived side by side, but slowly Neanderthals disappeared. Their last strongholds faded about 30,000 years ago, leaving only echoes in our DNA and in bones buried in caves. Why they vanished remains a mystery. Climate shifts, smaller populations, or competition may have played a role. Yet perhaps they did not vanish entirely, for part of them lives on in us. The Ice Age still ruled, its glaciers pressing across the north. But in southern Europe, humans painted caves with images of bison, horses, and mammoths. These were not random marks, but works of intention and skill. The caves of Lascaux and Chauvet hold walls alive with animals that seem to move in the flickering light of torches. Here was art as memory, as magic, as meaning. By 20,000 years ago, sapiens had reached the edges of Siberia. The cold was fierce, but they had learned to sew clothes from hides, build shelters of bone and snow, and carry fire wherever they went. Some followed herds across the land bridge of Berinia, stepping into the vast new world of the Americas. There they spread across 2 continents, adapting to deserts, forests, mountains, and plains. The human presence was now global. From Africa to Europe, from Asia to Australia, and now across the Americas, sapiens carried fire, stone, art, and stories. The Earth, once shared with many human cousins, was now becoming a world of one. Still, in those early millennia, humans remained wanderers. They were hunters and gatherers, moving with the seasons, following animals and ripening plants. They lived in small bands, bound by kinship and shared tasks. Nights were spent around fires, telling stories, perhaps singing, perhaps dreaming. The long journey of life had travelled from single cells in the sea to this. Creatures who could imagine gods, paint on stone, carve bone into flutes, and cross oceans with hope. The first life had been simple, blind to the future. Now life was self-aware, telling its own story in symbols, in art, and in whispers by the firelight. The Great Migration was nearly complete, but the story was still only beginning. Soon, these wandering bands would plant seeds, tame animals, and change the earth forever. The world of the hunter-gatherer was ancient and enduring. For tens of thousands of years, humans moved with the seasons, following herds across plains and forests, gathering nuts and fruits, fishing in rivers, and carrying fire into the dark. It was a rhythm as old as the species, and for a long time it seemed it would last forever. But the earth was changing, and so too were the people who walked upon it. Around 12,000 years ago, the Ice Age began to retreat. The great glaciers that had gripped the north melted back, releasing rivers and lakes across the land. The seas rose, swallowing coastal plains, shaping new shorelines. Where once mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses had wandered, grasses and forests spread. In this shifting world, humans discovered something new, not just how to live with the land, but how to shape it. In a region stretching from the eastern Mediterranean to the valleys of Mesopotamia, wild grains had long grown in abundance. Barley and wheat ripened in the fields, dropping seeds that could be gathered and ground into food. For countless generations, people had plucked these plants, carrying them back to their camps. But as the climate stabilized, they began to notice a truth. If seeds were scattered in soil, they would sprout again, and fields could be tended instead of merely found. The first steps toward farming were quiet, almost invisible. People still hunted gazelles and gathered figs, but they lingered longer in certain places. Camps became more permanent, fires more enduring. Slowly, the harvest was not only what nature provided, but what hands had sown. The wild became the tended, and humans crossed a threshold. With farming came settlement. Villages appeared where rivers and fertile soil met. In the Levant, places like Jericho grew from clusters of huts into lasting communities. Mud brick walls rose, protecting homes from floods or strangers. Life no longer depended only on the chase or the foraging path, but on cycles of planting, growth, and harvest. Animals, too, became part of this new rhythm. Wolves, drawn to the edges of human camps, found food scraps and warmth. Over generations, those who were gentler remained close, becoming companions. Dogs were the first domesticated partners, their watchful eyes guarding villages, their presence bound to people. Later, goats, sheep, and cattle were brought into human care, first hunted, then herded, then raised for milk, meat, and hides. The change was profound. For the first time, humans created food surpluses. A field of grain could feed more than a single family. A herd of goats could provide milk through the seasons. Villages could grow, supporting more people than the land had ever held before. With more people came new roles. Some hunted, some farmed, some shaped clay into vessels for storing grain, while others napped flint into blades or ground pigments into colours. Yet farming was not only gain, it was labour, constant and heavy. Fields had to be cleared, planted, weeded, and harvested. Where once hunters could move when food grew scarce, Farmers were tied to the soil, bound to seasons and weather. Drought could bring hunger, and storms could destroy a year's work. Disease spread more easily in crowded villages than in small wandering bands. Still, the path was set, and the old life of roaming grew rarer. From the Nile Valley to the Indus, from the Yellow River to the highlands of Mesoamerica, farming took root in different ways. Each region had its plants, its animals, its discoveries. In China, rice was cultivated in paddies, a labour that demanded water and careful tending. In the Americas, maize was shaped from wild grasses into a staple that would sustain great civilizations. Along the Andes, potatoes were dug from the soil, hardy against the cold. The earth itself was changing under human hands. Fields replaced forests, irrigation canals cut across plains, and villages rose from mud and stone. Humanity was no longer only part of nature. It was beginning to bend nature toward its will. And with farming came permanence. Families stayed in one place, generation after generation. Graves appeared beneath homes, marking ancestors as guardians of the hearth. Pots were decorated with symbols, their patterns carrying meaning as well as beauty. Walls were painted, figurines moulded, and shrines built. The human spirit, once expressed in cave paintings and carvings, now found a new stage in settled life. The first hints of hierarchy appeared. With surpluses, some families held more than others. Grain could be stored, shared, or withheld. Leadership was needed to organize fields, canals, and defenses. Slowly, the seeds of power, wealth, and inequality were planted alongside barley and wheat. Still, life in those early villages remained close to the earth. Days were marked by sunrise and sunset, by planting and harvest, by the cries of animals and the hum of insects. Nights glowed with firelight, where stories were told of ancestors and spirits, of animals and skies. The cosmos was a mystery, but now humans could stand in one place, year after year, and watch the stars return in their patterns. The heavens became calendars, guiding sowing and reaping, turning myth into measure. The great transformation of life, begun billions of years ago in the seas, had now reached a new threshold. Cells had learned to cooperate, to form bodies. Bodies had learned to think, to imagine. And now imagination had learned to settle, to build, to shape land and time itself. It was the dawn of a new age. Villages would grow into towns, towns into cities, and cities into civilizations. The story of life, once written only in seashells and stones, would now be etched in clay tablets, carved in temples, and sung in languages that carried across generations. The earth had given birth to life, and now life was remaking the earth. As villages grew, the quiet rhythm of planting and harvesting slowly gave way to something larger, more complex and more enduring. Along river valleys, where the soil was rich and the waters steady, humanity began to build not only homes and fields, but entire worlds of stone, clay, and memory. These would become the first civilizations, the early experiments in organizing life on a scale beyond the family, the village, or the wandering band. The rivers themselves were teachers. In Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates wound across a plain of fertile silt. Each spring their waters rose and fell, carving channels, leaving behind soils that could feed thousands. In Egypt, the Nile flowed with a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat, rising and receding with the seasons, turning the desert green. In the Indus Valley, rivers spread their waters across broad plains, feeding settlements that stretched far and wide. In China, the Yellow River carried heavy burdens of silt, both life-giving and destructive. These rivers tied people together. They demanded organization, canals to guide water, embankments to control floods, storage to guard against hunger. Fields had to be measured, labor coordinated, disputes settled. And so, slowly, new forms of leadership arose. Chiefs became kings, priests became organizers, and villages became cities. The city was something new, something the earth had not seen before. In Mesopotamia, the city of Uruk rose from the plains. Its walls stretched high, enclosing tens of thousands of people, its streets alive with traders, farmers, potters, and scribes. Within it stood temples built of mud brick, their stair-like shapes rising toward the sky. These temples, called ziggurats, were both places of worship and centers of power. Grain was stored there, offerings made and records kept. The gods of sky, earth, water, and storm were believed to dwell nearby, their will guiding the lives of humans. In Egypt, civilization was drawn tightly to the Nile. Every year the river flooded, spreading dark soil along its banks, and every year the people planted anew. Here, kings became pharaohs, rulers who were seen not merely as leaders, but as divine figures themselves, living embodiments of order. The pyramids of Giza, rising out of the desert, were more than tombs. They were symbols of stability, pointing skyward as if to link the human world with eternity. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa grew in ordered patterns, their streets laid out with care, their drains and wells showing an attention to daily life as much as to grandeur. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, little is known of their kings or gods, for their writing remains largely undeciphered. Yet their civilization spoke through its bricks, its weights and measures, its spread of goods across vast distances. In China, along the banks of the Yellow River, early dynasties rose, crafting rituals of ancestor worship and bronze vessels of exquisite detail. Power was tied not only to kingship but to the heavens themselves, with rulers claiming the mandate of heaven, the right to rule so long as they upheld balance and order. Across these civilizations, one invention stood at the heart of memory: writing. In Mesopotamia, scribes pressed reeds into clay tablets, creating cuneiform marks that could record grain tallies, debts, and offerings. What began as simple numbers grew into symbols for words and soon stories, prayers, and laws. The Epic of Gilgamesh, carved into clay, spoke of kings, floods, and the search for immortality. In Egypt, hieroglyphs decorated tomb walls and papyrus scrolls, combining pictures with sounds, weaving together sacred hymns and the names of rulers. Writing gave permanence to speech, turning fleeting words into marks that could cross centuries. With writing came memory, and with memory came law. In Mesopotamia, King Hammurabi's code was inscribed in stone, setting forth rules of justice and punishment, of property and duty. Laws bound people together, not just by custom, but by written decree, visible to all. This was a new kind of order, one that gave rulers authority not only through strength or divine claim, but through the written word. Trade, too, bound these civilizations. Rivers carried boats laden with grain, metals, and textiles. Overland routes carried obsidian, tin, and lapis lazuli across mountains and deserts. Merchants became travellers of culture, as well as goods, spreading ideas of art, religion, and craft. From Mesopotamia to the Indus, from Egypt to Nubia, from China to distant steppes, networks of exchange stitched together a wider human world. Religion remained at the heart of these early cities. Temples were built as houses for gods, rituals performed to ensure floods came on time, fields grew full and skies remained kind. Priests watched the stars, noting patterns of planets and constellations, weaving them into calendars and omens. The heavens became both a clock and a mystery, shaping human time while reflecting human wonder. Yet beneath the grandeur of cities and monuments, daily life continued much as it always had. Farmers bent over fields, women ground grain, children played in dusty streets, potters turned wheels, and herders tended their flocks. Life in the city was larger, more crowded, more ordered, but still filled with the same rhythms of survival: birth, work, hunger, laughter, love, and loss. The rise of civilizations was not without cost. Surpluses created hierarchies, and hierarchies hardened into classes. Kings and priests stood above, commanding labour and tribute, while workers and farmers toiled below. Slavery appeared, binding some lives entirely to the service of others. Wars were fought, cities raided, empires built and broken. The human story grew larger, but also sharper, edged with power and conflict. Still, the achievements of these early civilizations endured. Writing, cities, laws, temples, trade, all became foundations upon which later societies would build. The rivers that once carved valleys now carried cultures, and the people who once wandered forests and plains now shaped landscapes in their image. The earth, once home only to silent seas and drifting microbes, now echoed with the sounds of markets, the ringing of hammers, the chanting of priests, and the voices of thousands gathered together. Civilization had begun, and with it, a new chapter of the long unfolding story of life on Earth. As the earlier cities flourished, humanity entered a new age defined not only by rivers and fertile fields, but by the metals pulled from the Earth itself. The Bronze Age began when people discovered that copper, when mixed with a small amount of tin, created a material harder and sharper than stone, stronger than pure copper, and capable of holding an edge that could cut, carve, and endure. This discovery spread slowly at first, but once known, it reshaped entire societies. Bronze tools meant stronger ploughs, sharper axes, and more durable weapons. With them, forests could be cleared more efficiently, fields expanded, and armies equipped. Bronze ornaments glittered in the sun, signalling status and wealth, while bronze vessels carried offerings to the gods. The mastery of fire, which once allowed humans to survive cold nights, now transformed rock into metal, reshaping both the earth and human ambition. The Bronze Age was also an age of exchange. Tin, the essential ingredient, was rare, and its scarcity drew people into far-reaching networks of trade. Caravans crossed deserts, ships traced coastlines, and traders carried not only metal, but also ideas, stories, and customs. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan reached Mesopotamian temples, amber from northern Europe found its way to Mycenaean palaces, and Egyptian gold shone in the treasures of distant lands. The world was becoming connected in ways subtle and lasting, its threads woven together by merchants and sailors whose names are lost to time. In Mesopotamia, city-states grew into kingdoms, and kingdoms sometimes into empires. Sumer, Akkad, and later Babylon rose and fell across the plains, each leaving behind layers of brick, clay, and memory. Kings stood as symbols of both power and order, often claiming the favour of gods as the source of their rule. Hammurabi's laws still stood carved in stone, declaring justice as a balance between strength and fairness. Temples loomed large, their ziggurats climbing toward the heavens, while scribes filled clay tablets with cuneiform, preserving everything from trade accounts to epic tales. To the west, along the Nile, Egypt entered a time of glory. The Old Kingdom had built the pyramids, but now the Middle and New Kingdoms expanded Egypt's reach, sending armies into Nubia, Syria, and beyond. Pharaohs such as Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, and Ramses II etched their reigns into stone, leaving temples at Karnak and Abu Simbel, their walls covered with images of gods and victories. The Nile still governed life, but Egypt's gaze had widened, seeing itself as a great power among neighbours. Farther east, in the Indus Valley, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro eventually declined, their reasons still a mystery. Shifts in rivers, changing climates, or social strain may have played a role. Yet the legacy of their orderly streets and precise measurements hinted at a people who valued balance and structure. In China, dynasties grew in strength. The Shang kings ruled with rituals of bronze and oracle bones, inscribing questions to the spirits on shells and bones, seeking guidance from ancestors. The Zhou would later claim the mandate of heaven, setting forth an idea that rulers held power only so long as they upheld justice and balance. This notion, that authority was conditional and moral, would echo through centuries of Chinese thought. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, new powers began to stir. On the island of Crete, the Minoans built palaces at Knossos, with walls painted in vibrant frescoes of dolphins, dancers, and bull-leaping. Their ships sailed widely, carrying goods across the sea. Later, the Mycenaeans of mainland Greece rose, their citadels guarded by walls of massive stone. They left behind golden masks and tales of kings and warriors, echoes of which would eventually inspire Homer's epics of Troy. The Bronze Age was also an age of collapse. Around 1200 BCE, many of the great centres of power faltered. Cities burned, trade routes broke, and kingdoms fell in what historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse. The reasons remain debated. Perhaps invasions by migrating peoples, perhaps droughts and famine, perhaps the interwoven fragility of a world too tightly connected. Whatever the cause, once great civilizations staggered, and for a time much was lost. Writing waned, trade shrank, and palaces crumbled into ruins. But from these ashes, new forms arose. Iron, harder and more plentiful than bronze, began to shape weapons and tools. With iron came stronger ploughs and deadlier swords, and with them new empires. Assyria, fierce and relentless, carved an empire across Mesopotamia with armies of iron-clad warriors. Babylon rose again under Nebuchadnezzar, its hanging gardens, whether real or imagined, becoming a wonder of the ancient world. Persia followed, its kings ruling vast lands stretching from Greece to India, binding them together with roads, couriers, and tolerance for many cultures. In the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians sailed far and wide, founding colonies and spreading not only goods but also an alphabet, simple symbols that would one day evolve into the letters we use now. In Greece, small city-states like Athens and Sparta emerged, experimenting with forms of government that range from democracy to military oligarchy. Their philosophers began to ask questions not only of gods and rulers, but of reason, ethics, and the nature of existence. To the west, Rome began as a small settlement on the banks of the Tiber River. Its rise would be slow at first, but its story was only just beginning, and it would eventually reshape the known world. Throughout these ages, the human story grew more intricate, more layered, more ambitious. Cities rose and fell, empires expanded and collapsed. But life remained both fragile and enduring. Farmers still bent over fields, artisans still shaped clay and metal, children still played in courtyards, and songs still drifted across the air at dusk. The grandeur of kings and empires was built upon the simple persistence of daily lives, countless and unrecorded. The earth, which had once known only silence, then seas filled with drifting plankton, then forests of strange beasts now carried the footsteps of armies, the chants of priests, the laughter of markets, and the scratching of pens on parchment. Humanity was weaving itself into history, leaving marks that could not easily fade. As the Bronze Age faded and iron spread across the world, humanity entered a time we often call the Classical Age. It was an age when kingdoms became empires, when city-states experimented with new forms of government, when philosophers and poets began asking questions about truth and beauty, and when religions and teachings formed that would shape human thought for thousands of years. In Greece, the rugged mountains separated valleys and plains, and out of those landscapes rose the small but fierce city-states, each with its own ways and ambitions. Athens, with its open assembly of citizens, became known for democracy, a system fragile and imperfect, but new to the world. Here, ordinary men could gather, vote, and speak, shaping decisions of war and peace. In contrast, Sparta valued discipline and strength, training its citizens from youth for war, its society designed for endurance and unity. Greek culture shone through art, drama, and philosophy. Sculptors carved figures that seemed alive, playwrights told tragedies and comedies still performed today, and thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle posed questions that echoed far beyond their time. What is justice? What is virtue? What is knowledge? These questions, once asked, never truly faded. They became part of the human conversation, carried forward into every age that followed. But Greece was not only about philosophy, it was also about conflict. The Persians swept westward, seeking to bring the Greek lands under their rule, and for a time the small city-states stood together, fighting battles at Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. Later, the Peloponnesian War would pit Athens against Sparta, weakening both and leaving them vulnerable. Out of the north came Alexander of Macedon, remembered as Alexander the Great, whose armies marched farther than any Greek before him, reaching Egypt, Persia, and even into India. Wherever he went, Greek language, art, and ideas travelled too, mingling with the cultures he encountered. This blend, known as Hellenistic culture, spread across a vast region, and in its wake libraries, cities, and monuments rose. While Greece was shaping the world with ideas, Rome was rising from a small settlement on the banks of the Tiber River. Legend told of its founding by Romulus and Remus, but in time, myth gave way to history. Rome grew from a monarchy to a republic, where senators and magistrates governed, and where armies carried Roman standards outward, slowly expanding control over Italy and beyond. Roman discipline, roads, and law, allowed them to hold together a realm that grew with each generation. Rome's republic, like Athens' democracy, was fragile. Power often concentrated in the hands of a few, and as conquest brought wealth and slaves, inequalities deepened. Civil wars followed, and out of them rose figures such as Julius Caesar, whose ambition shook the old republic. His assassination could not restore the past, and soon Augustus emerged, the first emperor in name or not, bringing stability under imperial rule. The Roman Empire stretched from Britain to the deserts of Arabia, from Spain to the rivers of Mesopotamia. Its roads carried legions, its aqueducts carried water, and its cities carried the rhythms of Roman life: baths, forums, markets, and theatres. Latin, the language of Rome, spread across Europe, leaving roots that would blossom into French, Spanish, Italian, and other tongues. Roman law set patterns that later societies would draw upon, and Roman architecture left arches and domes that still stand, reminders of ambition carved into stone. Yet Rome, like all things, was not eternal. Pressures came from within and without: invasions from migrating peoples, economic strain, political upheaval, all weakened the empire. In the west, Rome eventually fell, its authority shattered, though in the east, Byzantium continued, carrying the flame of the empire for another 1,000 years. But even in decline, Rome left behind structures, ideas, and languages that would shape Europe long after its fall. Farther east, in India, civilizations also blossomed. The Vedic traditions had already laid down hymns and rituals, and from them grew philosophies that sought to understand not only the material world, but also the spiritual one. Hinduism, with its vast pantheon and deep sense of cycles, became a living tradition, while Buddhism, founded by Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, offered a path of compassion, mindfulness, and release from suffering. Jainism, too, offered a way of non-violence and discipline, urging respect for all living beings. India was also home to great empires. The Maurya Empire under Ashoka stretched across much of the subcontinent. Ashoka, once a conqueror, turned toward peace after witnessing the horrors of war, and he spread Buddhism far and wide, carving edicts into stone pillars that still stand today. Centuries later, the Gupta Empire nurtured what has been called a golden age, when art, literature, science, and mathematics flourished. Indian thinkers calculated the concept of zero, mapped the movements of planets, and wrote poetry and epics that still inspire. In China, the Zhou dynasty gave way to the Xin. The Xin, though short-lived, left a lasting mark under the rule of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor who unified China. He standardized weights, measures, and even the script, binding the land together, and he began the Great Wall, a barrier against invasions from the north. After the Qin came the Han dynasty, remembered as one of China's greatest ages. The Han opened trade along the Silk Road, connecting China to Central Asia and beyond, sending silk westward and receiving horses, glass, and ideas in return. Confucianism became the guiding philosophy of governance, teaching order, duty, and respect. Taoism, with its quiet embrace of balance and the flow of nature, offered another perspective, while Buddhism, arriving from India, found new roots in Chinese soil. The classical civilizations each offered their gifts. From Greece came philosophy and the seeds of democracy. From Rome came law, roads, and architecture. From India came mathematics, epics, and spiritual traditions. From China came philosophies of balance, unity, and harmony, as well as inventions like paper and the compass that would one day change the world. These civilizations rose not in isolation, but often in contact with one another. Traders, travellers, and ambassadors carried goods and stories along the routes that connected them. Silk from China, spices from India, papyrus from Egypt, olive oil from Greece, all moved across the ancient world. Alongside them travelled ideas, religions, philosophies, tales of distant places, and methods of calculation and governance. Through these centuries, ordinary life continued. Farmers tilled fields, potters shaped clay, and shepherds guided flocks across hills. Markets rang with voices, storytellers recited epics, and children played in courtyards, their laughter mingling with the sounds of a world that was, in its way, becoming smaller through contact and exchange. The grandeur of empires and the brilliance of philosophers rested upon the daily efforts of countless unnamed hands. As the classical age deepened, humanity's memory grew longer, its ambitions broader, and its connections more intricate. The earth, once silent and lifeless, was now alive not only with creatures and plants, but with civilizations whose marks would endure. Temples, libraries, scrolls, and monuments became the new fossils, layers of human thought and labour left behind for future generations to discover. The journey from the first sparks of life to the rise of classical civilizations had taken billions of years, yet in this span of human time, just a few thousand years, so much had unfolded. The foundations of law, philosophy, religion, science, and art had been laid, and from them the future would continue to grow. The classical civilizations had left their mark upon the earth. Greece had carved statues and questions into stone and dialogue. Rome had stretched its legions across continents and built roads that endured. India had nurtured its epics and its mathematics, and China had unified under dynasties that cultivated philosophy, art, and invention. Yet time continued, and the mighty did not remain unshaken. The transition from what we call the ancient world into what is remembered as the medieval world was not a sudden moment, but a slow drifting of centuries. As empires fell, new faiths rose, and the patterns of life adjusted quietly to new rhythms. In the West, the Roman Empire faced strain upon strain. The empire had grown immense, and with that size came difficulties. Borders were long, armies were expensive, and the loyalty of distant provinces often wavered. Within, political struggles and corruption weakened the old unity, while economic troubles made stability harder to maintain. From beyond Rome's borders came migrating peoples, Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, and others, pressing inward, seeking land, opportunity, or refuge from other pressures farther east. In the year 476, the Western Roman Empire was said to have fallen, when the last emperor in Rome was deposed. But though the political structure collapsed, life itself did not vanish. Farmers still tended fields, blacksmiths hammered iron, and traders carried their goods along roads that Rome had once built. The great cities shrank, many into quiet ruins, but villages and towns continued. The eastern half of the empire, centred in Constantinople, endured as the Byzantine Empire, carrying forward Roman laws, Greek traditions, and Christian faith. Byzantium stood at the crossroads of continents, between Europe and Asia, between the Mediterranean and the Near East. Its capital, Constantinople, glittered with domes and mosaics, its walls strong against sieges. For centuries it held firm, preserving texts, art, and knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. From here radiated a Christian empire that shaped much of Eastern Europe, sending missionaries northward and eastward, carrying with them not only faith, but also script and learning. At the same time, a new faith was born in the Arabian Peninsula. In the early 7th century, the Prophet Muhammad began teaching in Mecca, calling for devotion to one God, compassion for the poor, and a community built on justice and prayer. From those beginnings, Islam spread swiftly, carried by both words and swords, by preachers and by armies. Within a century, vast lands from Spain to Central Asia were part of a new Islamic world, connected by shared language, law, and culture. The Islamic Golden Age brought flourishing knowledge. In cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Damascus, scholars translated ancient Greek works into Arabic, preserving and expanding upon them. Mathematics grew. With algebra and new methods of calculation, medicine advanced. With careful observations and hospitals, astronomy charted the skies, and literature produced poetry that still echoes. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became a beacon where ideas from Greece, Persia, India, and beyond mingled, creating a fusion of thought that would later filter back into Europe. In Europe, after the fall of Rome, kingdoms rose among the Germanic peoples. The Franks became powerful under leaders like Charlemagne, who sought to unite much of Western Europe. He supported learning and law, though his empire fragmented after his death. Across these centuries, feudalism emerged as a pattern. Lords granting land to vassals in exchange for service, peasants tied to the soil, and castles dotting the landscape. Life was often local, revolving around the manor, the village, and the fields nearby. The Christian church became a unifying force across much of Europe. Monasteries preserved manuscripts, copied texts, and offered places of quiet devotion. Pilgrims travelled to shrines, cathedrals rose with spires reaching toward the sky, and rituals gave rhythm to life, from baptism to burial. The church also held power, both spiritual and temporal, sometimes clashing with kings, sometimes guiding them. Daily life in the medieval world was not lived in grandeur, but in steady repetition. A farmer rose with the sun, tilled the soil, tended animals, and measured time by the seasons. Craftsmen shaped tools, shoes, or cloth, their guilds forming communities of shared skill. Markets bustled on certain days, when villagers gathered to exchange goods and news. Winter brought long nights by the hearth, telling stories or mending equipment. Festivals punctuated the year with colour, music, and ritual, a break from the steady labour of survival. In Asia, dynasties continued their cycles. In China, after the Han came periods of division, but unity returned under the Tang dynasty. The Tang era is often remembered as a golden age of poetry, art, and openness. Trade along the Silk Road flourished, bringing goods and ideas into the empire. Later, the Song dynasty advanced technologies. Gunpowder, printing, and the compass began to shape the world in ways that would one day transform distant continents. In India, kingdoms and empires shifted across centuries, with art and religion deeply woven into life. Hinduism remained a central tradition, Buddhism persisted in places, and new waves of Islamic rule brought their influence too, especially in architecture and learning. Temples, stupas, and mosques rose, their designs speaking of devotion and craftsmanship. Farther north, in the steppes of Central Asia, nomadic peoples moved with their herds, shaping history through sudden migrations and invasions. Their horses gave them speed and power, and from these plains would one day ride the Mongols, who would shake the world. In Africa, kingdoms and cultures thrived. Along the Nile, along the Niger River, and across the Sahara, trade linked salt, gold, and knowledge. In West Africa, Ghana and later Mali rose, with cities like Timbuktu becoming centres of learning and commerce. Caravans crossed deserts, carrying goods and stories between distant lands. The medieval world was vast, diverse, and full of contrasts. In one place, a peasant ploughed a field with an ox. In another, a scholar bent over manuscripts by lamplight. In another, a merchant led camels across deserts. Life was often hard, uncertain, and bound by custom, yet it was also rich with community, faith, and the slow flowering of ideas. The period stretched across centuries, filled with wars, crusades, alliances, and betrayals. Yet behind the noise of battles and crowns, the true weight of history lay in the countless lives lived quietly, planting, weaving, studying, praying. Humanity had come far from the first sparks of life, far from the tiny cells in ancient seas. Now it was a world of empires and kingdoms, faiths and philosophies, inventions and traditions, each weaving threads into the great tapestry. By the close of the medieval age, the stage was quietly being set for new shifts, for trade that would circle the globe, for printing presses that would spread words quickly, for ideas that would question old orders, and for voyages that would link all continents. But in the soft twilight of the medieval world, the earth itself still turned as it always had, under the same stars, with seas and mountains that had seen it all before. And so, from the quiet stirrings of the very first molecules that sought to copy themselves, through oceans teeming with unseen creatures, forests walked by towering reptiles, continents shifting like slow breaths, and the rise and fall of empires, we have traced a path that stretches nearly 4 billion years. It is a story not of heroes and kings alone, but of countless small lives, cells dividing, plants spreading their leaves, animals seeking food and shelter, and human beings, with their questions and their hopes, shaping villages, cities, and civilizations. Every age seemed complete in its own time, though always giving way to what followed. The earth remains here, steady and vast, carrying within it all the echoes of what has been. The stars still shine as they did when the first tiny spark of life appeared, and as they did when the first humans looked up in wonder. And even now, as we tell this long, winding story, the future is already unfolding, one quiet moment after another. So let us rest for now, knowing that the tale of life is not yet finished. It continues, softly, endlessly, with the same patience that has carried it this far. Thank you for sharing this long journey. Sleep well, and we'll meet again in another story, beneath the same sky.